think my question was about if I go to work with the borough, I work with civic institutions, and I say I want to do Estuarine mapping, do we just map everything they think that they are trying to able to do?
Yeah, you might restrict it a bit. What we actually found is this is very effectively sold as a pre-process. So we're saying don't not do the thing you were going to do anyway, but do this first because it will make it easier. And that's actually quite useful. So it will depend on the scope, all right? And that's why you might do an initial analysis of actants in the system. You might look at aims first and then say, okay, we'll focus on those areas. Yeah.
Thank you. Then I would just ask Paul. I think your question has the most votes, so please, Paul, you can ask the question directly.
Well, it's not a real question. It's just a revealing that I didn't understand enough, and it's just the way it is. But maybe what would help if you could try to use an example of a certain system, any organization where you describe how it works in terms of constraints and constructors.
Okay, so I'll give you an example. I mean, this I did with Tom, all right? I think Tom's documented it, and that's available online, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we were working with Volkswagen Audi Group and 5 or 6 partners. They'd had government funding to produce a new type of electrical charging system. That funding was now running out. There was a massive amount of conflict because now it's about money and cost and ownership. So instead of going through the normal fight, we did Esturine mapping. It took 2 half days. We normally do this afternoon and morning. Turns out to be the perfect combination. And we ended up with 40 actual examples, yeah, projects that they all agreed they should do. And I remember they said, we've never thought of these beforehand. Now we can't see why we didn't think of them, and we're just going to do these before we get into the politics. That's why I said it's really well sold as a pre-process before you move into a traditional strategy. Yeah. So that would be an example, right? And I say they ended up with 40 very specific actions. So let's go and do these first and see what happens. Then the strategy will be a lot clearer.
My question was more, what were their constraints and what were their structures?
Can't share that from a client.
Right, but maybe just something simple where just...
Well, yeah, I've given you an example. A constraint is a process. So, you know,
okay.
If I was still working for IBM, there are so many bloody constraints that some of the constructors in the expense controls are basically inhibiting. Yeah.
Okay.
I really need to reduce the energy costs and the time to fill out an expense sheet. Yeah. So that would be a practical example in cultural change, right?
Thank you, Dave. Paul, enough, or did you answer your question both? So constraints and constructors?
Sure.
Okay, great.
I have to read up more.
Me too.
But thank you so far.
Then I think Gelinde has a very interesting question.
Yeah, you know, when listening to you with all those details and comparison and great pictures, by the way, that you're bringing up, how long have you actually been thinking about this?
I keep having this argument with people who interview 5 clients, throw together a method, and then sell certification. All right. We spend about 6 or 7 years on the theory. And that's how long this one has taken. It's been 7 years in gestation.
Mm-hmm.
And it would normally take 4 or 5 years in practice. This has actually gone in 1 year where it would normally take 4 or 5 years. And, you know, we actually say to people, you should be mentored the first time because you need to understand the theory if you get hit with a difficult question. Yeah. And to my mind, good methods, that's the way they work. We don't start with, we take an anti-empirical approach. We don't say you go and study what people have done, identify theory from that, and create recipes. We say identify the issue, see what natural science says about that issue, because natural science, you know, has been tested, peer-reviewed, and everything else. Develop methods and tools consistent with the natural science, and once we got them ready, then go and modify them in practice, but only modify them in line with the theory. So it's much more like physics in that sense, all right? You start with the maths. Once you've got the maths, you then move into the experimental stage. So that's how Kinevin got developed as well. And I've developed over 100 methods and, you know, 2 software packages now. They've all gone down that route.
Is it okay to ask a second question, or should I just put it down? Yeah.
Go for it.
On that, I think, you know, when listening to you, it really sounds like you're describing technical process-related questions. Now, in every transition or transformation, there is always people involved, right? And those I find a little bit less predictable, even if there may be science and psychology. So would you say that your mapping framework is actually, a decision framework is actually helping more on, I don't know, maybe you get my
Both. If you read the
confusion.
white paper, so for example, we map narratives in the organization to map culture. Those narratives are assemblages. Assemblages are actually a type of constraint. So we can build a constraint based on stories that people have told about how they're getting on and how they're not going on. And then we can say, how would we create more stories like these and fewer stories like those, which is shifting something around on the grid. So constraints and constructors can be technical processes, but they can also be attitudes and beliefs. And
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically every dot that you have there, whatever color it is, it represents one of those stories.
Could represent a cluster of those stories, or it could represent something physical. We're not saying it's one or the other. We're saying all of them come together, right?
Helped.
So that's the principle. So that was a great question, by the way. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gelinde. Thank you, Dave. Then let's move on to the next question from Maru. If it's okay, Maru, then I will read the question, hopefully get all. So Dave, would you mind elaborating with example, if possible, how Estuarine mapping is used in strategy, in particular the tactic of moving pieces constraints?
This is stage 2 of Estuarine mapping, which we've just released. All right, there's going to be a stage 3 next year, which is more exciting. All right, so what stage 2 does is it's a pre-process before you do conventional strategy. So it basically says you should do much more work on situational assessment before you jump into what we should be doing. So that's the principle, right? So it's a pre-process for strategy. Where it is going, because we can now generate this table using software. We don't recommend they're doing that first. We recommend doing it in a workshop, but we can now generate this over the whole of the workforce in software. The reason we're doing that is then we can actually, the map can become a dynamic map. It's constantly changing. And what we're going to be doing in stage 3 is changing the representation so it's more symbolic, with alerts coming up when you need to pay attention to things, opportunities opening up. So what we're actually going to be doing next year is, in military terms, combining grand strategy and tactics in a single framework. So the way this will work is people, and this is fractal representation, there'll be a screen with symbols which people are trained in, which will show them how the current strategy is evolving, the opportunities presenting themselves for rapid intervention. And that will be presented at company level or divisional level or work group level, all from the same source data. So we're moving to something which is dynamic, real-time, continuous, rather than something which is a linear process of grand strategy, tactics, implementation. So we're trying to make that non-linear. But for the moment, this is a pre-process before you do something conventional.
Cool. Thank you, Dave. Then I'll move to the next question from Anna Olsen. Do you like to ask directly, or should I read?
I can ask. I've just been thinking a lot about sort of trying it out and which context I should try the method out in. And then I've just question about how much of a sense of direction do you actually need before you sort of start to put up your constraints and constructors?
You want a sense of awareness of where you are, not a sense of where you want to be. I do a lot of walking, all right? And there's times where you have to, you're in mist, you're in fog, you've just sunk up to your waist in a bog, all right? Very cold. This is a real story from 4 days ago, right? And what you're trained to do I was on mountain rescue, is stop thinking about where you want to be, focus on where you are, what you can do now, how you can stabilize the position, then look at where you go next. And that's what this is about. It's about a real focus on getting a complete agreement about the situation and opportunities before you jump into where we should go and where we want to be. Yeah.
Okay, so as little sense of direction as possible then, the answer?
And that's why we're selling it as a pre-process at the moment. What we have actually found is people use it as a pre-process, then realize actually they don't need to do the next stage anymore, because they're doing lots of small changes and the situation is changing. So if we do this in software, we can redo the map every week or every month. We change the energy gradient. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Then Michael Kramer, do you like maybe?
Yeah, thank you. I find the model and all the thinking behind it very elaborate, and the metaphors are already very helpful to understand the motivation. But I think it would be even more helpful if you could experience all these things. And my question is, can you think of any way to gamify those concepts in order to feel what this is actually about?
We've actually done so there's two senses of gamify. One is allowed people play games with you. We've done a lot of work to stop that happening. Yeah. Because that's manipulative. But no, this can be gamified, all right? We do it with physical objects. We can use metaphor cards. We can use illustrations. We've got actually more sophisticated metaphor typologies behind this, which will be in the kits, all right? So we can make it much more fun. And as I say, what we've actually found is half a day and half a day works brilliantly. So you do half a day to get the Esturine map out. Then you let people have a rest that evening. You don't do it all in one day because they've had to do a lot of rethinking. You have a drink, have a chat afterwards, talk about it. Then next day, come back in and do the actions. And that seems to work really well. The other fascinating thing is the dark effect has really had major traction. It's made people aware of how much they don't understand and therefore how much risk they are if they just jumped into things. But what we're doing is, so we've created online training for this. We're creating physical training. We're offering mentoring services. We're about to start to certify mentors, and who we don't certify will tell you what we think, whatever they say of their experience, all right? We're recommending people are mentored on this the first time, because you need somebody who understands enough about the theory to handle objections, because if you don't understand the theory, you'll get hit by the objections and you'll give in, which is always a mistake on something new. As I say, normally these things take 4 or 5 years to get traction. This has taken a year to get traction. So we're putting more mentoring in than we would normally do. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael, for the question, and Dave. Then the next question would be from, I think, Joanna, if I pronounce it right.
It's Jona. I'm sorry, I'm sitting completely in the dark, so maybe you don't see me very well. But I'm coming from a learning part, and we are often asked that companies or the employees need to learn about digitalization or some leadership skills, and usually the people need to go to workshops 2 or 3 days. In our opinion, most of the time, quite nonsense. And we are already trying to talk to the learners, so to really understand their needs when it comes to the skills the company wants them to learn. But I would like to hear or you're thinking about how else could it approach by a sense-making model, by your model.
Yeah, what we're thinking of, this is modular, so you can put things together in different combinations, all right? The way we've been thinking about on that, because it's come up a few times, is getting individuals to create their own Esturine map with a bit of coaching. So in my life, where I am at the moment, what are the constraints? What are the constructors? What are the effects that I can't control? What's in my control? What's out of my control? That's the counterfactual line. Yeah. And then we can consolidate that data to get a much better picture of what's actually going on. And we can work with the OD department or the HR department or the board to actually produce their map of how they think it is, and then contrast how they think it is with what we're getting bottom up, and then start to do interventions between that. So that's one of the areas we're interested in. There's a lot of interest in using Esturine at an individual level. Yeah, it shifts you away from talking about capabilities, competencies, psychodynamics, frameworks. What are the constraints? What are the constructors? How can I change them? How can I make my life easier? Is a much simpler way of going about things. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Then,
yeah, which might be of interest. One of the things we're doing with new joiners at the moment is getting them to keep a daily learning diary. So get junior staff to keep a learning diary. This is within SenseMaker. And every 2 weeks, they're given a senior member of staff to go and interview to capture their stories. That's a good integration technique. But what they're doing as they gather that is we're gathering the narrative pathway of their experience when they joined the company. And from that, we can extract the constraints and constructors and see what's harming and what's making the journeys easier. So there are various combinations of things we can do here.
Thank you.
Sounds good and challenging. Thanks. Well,
Let's for the next questioner. So Jens, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm still struggling with the metaphor of Esturine. So I see both concepts, but I don't see the connection between these two. Maybe you can help a little bit, because metaphor works better if you see the connection.
You can call it an affordance grid if you want, right? If you don't like the Esturine metaphor. The point I'm trying to make with an estuary is you've got a highly complex ecosystem in which actually things can go in both directions. There are things you can only do at certain times, you can't do at other times. Buoyancy changes based on brackishness. So the system will be more or less buoyant depending on the amount of salt water. So it's a metaphor to get across the fact that things don't go in straight lines. They're not linear. They can go backwards as well as forwards. It's messy. All right, you've got strategic decisions to make. So, for example, do you employ native guides to get boats through the sandbanks, or do you dredge a channel and buoy it? And that's very expensive. So there's lots you can build on with the metaphor.
And both are based upon energy gradients and
yeah. I mean, if you don't know, I partly do this on Frieson's free energy principle. There's some fascinating stuff coming out of quantum mechanics at the moment. I've just reading the papers, which is arguing that information has mass in a form that we don't understand, the fifth type of matter, and that would account for dark matter. Right now, if information has mass, it has momentum. That gets really interesting. Yeah, because matter obviously translates to energy. All right, so we're basically that becomes fascinating. Right, so this is going to develop more and more. But if you look at it, Frieson's free energy principle, quantum mechanics, Deutsch's work on constructor theory, there's a whole body of stuff now which is focusing on energy first. Yeah? And by the way, the time dimension will change next year as well. We're working on that at the moment. At the moment, we're looking at linear time. But actually, time changes for human beings based on intensity of interaction. So there's a whole anthropology of time. So expect some more dimensions on that next year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then, Stefan Büche, you get the next question. If you can speak, otherwise I can read the question. So,
already been, Dave gave the example before, so it's already been answered.
Okay, so going in the same direction. Thank you.
Yeah.
Then, Mark.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. My question is, Dave, I forget the term you use about humans not being aware of the context in which they are in. My dyslexia gets in the way, but I understand the concept. And my question is, because this is a complexity framework, does it help to have an understanding of the Cynefin sort of domains for people to do this, or is it not necessary?
No, necessary. I mean, there are three major frameworks in the Cynefin pantheon. All right, one is Cynefin itself. The other is Flexure's curves, which is our equivalent of Wardley mapping, and they're compatible. And the third is this, which is Esturine, which is probably the one you would start with. Once you've got fractions, you might then put them into Cynefin, because Cynefin is once we know what we've got to do, what type of thing is it, how do we do it?
So a friend of mine that are very interested in testing this out, and I didn't sign up in time for the course for the training. You're saying you have a how-to guide coming at the end of October? Is that
we
just could play with?
They just put 4 more. We've got a guide coming out, and we're offering mentoring services on in-house projects as well as the training. So you might want to look at that. Yeah.
Excellent. That will be on the Cynefin website, the mentoring services.
At the moment, we've got about 4 people we trust to mentor on this, apart from me and Anna and Beth and Ellie. We are actually running this as a full exercise in DC at the KM World Conference, so that will be interesting in November.
Wonderful.
Cool. Thank you, Mark. Then, Gelinde, have again the next question.
Sorry. I was interested in how many people you actually feel comfortable doing this or sensible to do that with. And it seems as if it's been part of the organization. So what was the largest organization that you applied it to?
We're just a year into this, all right? So we're now starting to do it with 1 or 2 people in small teams, just for that team or that individual. If we're doing it at a company level, we've never had less than about 20, 25.
Oh.
Yeah, in a workshop, but I don't think that's a limit either up or down, right? I've actually run Cynefin workshops with 2,000 people in a basketball court. You can do it. It's called large group facilitation. It's very different from open source. It's a highly constructed dance. So we could take that method across into Esturine Mapping without a problem. Yeah. But if you're going to do it with more than 30, 40, 50 people, you really need to, you put more effort into the preparation and the structure, yeah, than you do with a smaller amount.
And you all work on one grid
Well, we have to actually now started to do them in parallel processes in separate rooms. So have employees and managers doing the same process in parallel and comparing the results.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you can also do that. But the dominant use is normally groups of people, 4 or 5 groups of small numbers of people on different tables working in parallel, comparing results, combining results, yeah, backwards and forwards. A fairly standard complex facilitation though.
Thank you.
Then I think the last question is from Rufat.
Yeah, my question is more philosophical. Dave, you mentioned 3 conditions for emergence,
Yeah.
2 of them being a lot of actants and richness of their interactions, which seems to be ontological properties of the system itself.
Yeah.
And the 3rd condition seems to be epistemological about what each actant knows about the system. I wonder why you bring in epistemology here, and is there any pure ontological definition of conditions for emergence?
And I'd actually argue that I think the way I phrased it is epistemological, but you could phrase it as a negative ontological statement. If you think you've got awareness of the whole, you've misunderstood the ontology. But the basic fact is that, I mean, I'm really going with the literature here. Those are the 3 conditions you'll see most often quoted, right? And it sort of makes sense because actually there are epistemological elements to the interactions. If I look at a rhizomic structure, for example, tree roots actually know where another tree's roots come from a related tree from the same parentage. And fungal roots connect tree roots so that deeper tree roots can actually divert resources to sapling. Right? So there's some very sophisticated stuff when we get into the rhizomic structure of nature, which we think is replicated in humans. At that point, ontology and epistemology get mixed up a bit. What you're trying to do is make damn sure you get rid of all the phenomenology. And epistemologically can be validated, ontology just is, right? And as I say, the really exciting thing from my point of view, from a Deleuzian point of view, from new materialism, is this is actually a deterritorialization. So what you're doing is the system has become territorialized and pattern trained around the dominant power groups within the organization. This breaks that down completely. So it deterritorializes. So the existing power can't dominate the output.
Thanks.
We got 2 new questions. First one was from, I think, Maru, you also raised your hand. Maybe if you have also something to ask, I will give you first a chance.
Thank you. I should have done the same for my question earlier. It was badly phrased. So, but here's the context. I'm interested in the cultural and ethnographic aspects of doing strategy, and I've already talked to you about this over a year ago. I asked a similar question, but not related to Estuarine mapping. So here's my question: can I use, and if yes, how, these constraints, these little hexagons, to do some level of modeling of some ethnographic aspects or cultural elements in an enterprise or any group?
The answer is yes, you can, right? And that may be one of the pre-processes you do to gather material. So we're actually using our narrative software to populate the grids. So we're getting people to come up with examples as they go around on a day-to-day basis, index it, and then we compute the grid. They're not placing their stuff onto the grid. They're answering questions about what they've captured, and then we can compute it. Yeah. So there are lots of different variations on that, Maru.
So you do it by collecting narrative. That means it could be stories, could be that.
Could be stories, observations. What you don't want is the key thing on narrative work and ethnographic work is no evaluations. Yeah. And as I say, we then have what we do with our own software is it's called epistemic. People interpret their own narrative. It's not interpreted by facilitators or by computers. And that allows us to do it. But you could just gather the stories and put them on hexes and position them on the graph. Yeah,
that's always been the problem. Classic error, for example, in management consulting, you get somebody to put some level 1 to 5 on some statement, and then you pollute the whole thing, and then you end up working with fake data.
Voting, Likert scales and dot voting are the enemies of.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Maru, for the questions. Then let's continue with Lisa, I think. Lisa's.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to learn with you. And I'm really new to the frameworks and the language. And So I'm just really curious, especially in the times that we're living in this week, these past few days, how do you work with multicultural groups where they do not have a shared language?
We often use symbols, not language. Right? Yeah, I mean, symbols can be quite powerful. Semiotics are universal. We do a lot of peace and reconciliation work, which I can't talk about much. I mean, the one project we were going to do has just gone, shall we say, up in a pile of smoke in the Middle East. So that one's not going to come off now.
Yes.
But I'm working on red-blue peace and reconciliation in the States at the moment. And that involves children gathering stories, identifying common patterns in stories, and then working across the political divide on things they already agree are common problems, and letting them have a discussion about their differences when they're ready to have it, right? And not have it in a mediated environment with somebody from a cultural perspective. That's my objection to Sharmaga and stuff like that. It's very culturally specific.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of results they want. So there's a body of other techniques around this that you might be interested in on that, right? Increasingly these days, when we gather in narrative, we're using symbols, not words, for people to interpret.
And where your website or where in your organization are you training and building that capacity?
That's in Narrative Basecamp, if you look on the site.
Which base camp? Say that again.
Called Narrative Basecamp. So
Narrative
Basecamp, all right, and that's a training by doing. If you're interested in that, also drop me a note via the website, then I'll make sure they're aware on that side of it.
Dave, thank you so much for the leadership and the risk you take in bringing this work into the world. I really appreciate it, and I honor the work you've done with the people you're doing it with. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for the great question and your feedback. Dave, then let's continue with, I think, Anna Olsen, you have another question. You can go.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you talked a little bit about using it for smaller groups. Do you have any experiences you can share around how you do that? Or
yeah, we're actually talking about this tomorrow with one of the Agile coaching companies as a new offer they can provide. So sitting down with a team and getting them to construct an Esturine map, and then also using the Gamba version of the software to gather feedback from their customers and from each other. That's sort of team-based 360. Team-based 360 with Esturine mapping goes really well together with small groups. Yeah, because again, it stops them arguing, say, in a retrospective about what went wrong, what went right, what we should try and achieve next. It says, how do we make life easier? Esturine mapping fundamentally says, how do we make life easier? Right? Is a good way of summarizing it, and that's a really good thing with a small team. Yeah. It also, what we have found is that if you do this with several small teams in parallel, and you give them a common constraint structure, so you give them a set of constraints and constructors from another workshop, put them on the grid, agree where they are on the grid, then compare the results, then have a conversation. That is so powerful, and it's basic principle of complexity work. You never, as a consultant, analyze something. You put people into a position where they can see that other people saw things differently by going through the same process.
Okay, so you let them use the other group's constraints then. Thank you.
Thank you again for that nice question. Then our final question, I would say, there's one from, I'm not sure, Rufat, did you ask again?
Yes, that's my next question.
Yeah, great, then let's go.
The question is, the typology of constraints and constructors used primarily to enrich their accumulation, or there is a use after you do the initial sense making and putting it on the grid?
Yeah, I've been getting irritated with people in the beta test group because they keep trying to simplify the input. And I say, look, I'm going to use this stuff later. We're now working on how do you build constructors, how do you build constraints, yeah? And what type do you want? So the typology is actually going to come into the intervention side probably early next year. And that's why I don't want to use the language now, because it's going to be really important when we come to that. So building constructors and creating constraints it's a different type of intervention from outcome. Yeah.
Right. So there is no yet any information available publicly about?
No, we're kind of like ready to go into alpha on that now. All right. So constructor, ironically, constructing constructors, right, is something I've been playing around with for 6 months now. And I've got some difference there with Deutsche. Deutsche says constructors don't change in the act of construction. We're saying they can in a human system. Right? They'll have some sort of continuity of identity. So starting to intervene by changing the constraints or creating constructors, contagion is actually much more powerful, as we know from the internet, than control. Right? So if I can create contagion around a more desirable set of narratives, that's a constructor.